Okay, our next speaker is Chris Keith. Chris is Professor of New Testament Early Christianity, but also Director of the Centre for Social Scientific Study. The Bible, I couldn't remember the end of my own sentence. Chris has worked in actually a number of areas. His early stuff was on the woman caught in adultery, in John's Gospel. He works on media and Christian origins, but probably, I guess, most well known for his work on Jesus and social memory. I was going to try and think of a joke for Chris, but I couldn't because Mo stole my joke about Chris and buns. Anyway.
It was a very interesting welcome to St. Mary's. I think James and I would both run through that wall there for Mo, though, so we are very appreciative of her. In an important monograph from 2010, and a slightly earlier article, classicist William A. Johnson articulated a theory of ancient reading communities. He noted how manuscripts, as physical manuscripts, stood at the center of reading communities, and that ability to read these manuscripts, know their intricate details of grammar, etc., was an identity marker for certain elite cultures in the Roman Empire. They gathered to read certain books, and they read certain books in order to gather. So a key marker of the community was that they were invested in these particular reading practices. And the books themselves became symbolic representations of who they were, or at least who they thought they were. This may sound all rather obvious, but in a culture where few could read or afford antiquarian manuscripts, these practices reinforced their identities by marking them off from everyone who couldn't. It's also not completely different from New Testament scholars who walk around with their Nestle Island out at a conference, lest anyone at Starbucks confuse them for something other than a Bible nerd. Johnson was concerned with reading events in the sense of socio-historical circumstances, with book rolls at the center of the group gathering. And this approach has great relevance for understanding Jewish and Jesus-following assemblies as well. But in what follows in this paper, I want to advance Johnson's theory by transferring it to the literary level and consider reading events that are internal to texts. By this, I refer to instances of authorial reflection on what they're doing when they write Jesus books. Theo Heckel referred to these as Selbstreflexion, and Francois Bovin commented on these as times when authors reflect on a metalinguistic level. Those are nice phrases, but I would rather call them instances of textual self-consciousness. And at times, I think textual self-consciousness, very different kind of consciousness. Textual self-consciousness. It crystallizes into what I would call competitive textualization. In other words, sometimes texts are not only aware of themselves as written tradition, but they have other instances of written tradition in their peripheral vision. Right? Thus, I want to track here not only how early Jesus followers produced gospels by kind of a form of textual cannibalism, consuming prior texts and redeploying them, but also how they talked about it. And this is part of a much larger project, a book project that I hopefully will be done with at the end of this year. I'm only going to talk about 2 early instances of this in the Jesus tradition. I will say, though, I was glad to hear John speak of Christ assemblies. However cumbersome it is, that's the language I've adopted in this book as well. So now if somebody doesn't like it, I can blame it on John. I think this evidence is important, particularly in light of some comments from so-called performance critics that manuscripts themselves were unimportant to the transmission of the Jesus tradition. Thus, in the spirit of Eli Cash and his masterpiece, O Custer, everyone knows that writing Gospels was commonplace and insignificant among early Jesus followers. What this lecture presupposes is, maybe it wasn't. Let's start basically by rendering the familiar a little bit less familiar. In the 40-year stretch between the late 20s and 30s and Mark's textualization around 70, there were no written Gospels of which we can be certain. I realize John and Sarah here. of which we have concrete evidence. And even if someone wants to affirm Q, you just transfer everything I'm going to say about Mark back to Q. So in the 40-year stretch in the 40-year stretch after the textualization of Mark, at least 4 certain examples emerged: the Gospel of Mark, the Gospel of Matthew, Gospel of Luke, and Gospel of John. And possibly as many as 8, depending on when one dates the Gospel of Thomas, Gospel of Peter, Marcion's Gospel, and the Edgerton Gospel. If you are inclined to include Papias' expositions of the sayings of the Lord as textualized Jesus tradition, even though it did not, to our knowledge, earn the Evangelion label, there could have been as many as 9 by this time or thereabout. Most scholars would understandably hesitate to date many of these texts to the very beginning of the 2nd century, but certainly by the mid-2nd century there were at least this many written Gospels or Gospel-like texts, and the number could increase to at least 20 if we extend to the mid-2nd century and add books that have occasionally been dated to this time. The so-called Jewish Christian Gospels, that is, the Gospel of the Hebrews, the Gospel of the Ebionites, and the Gospel of the Nazarenes, if these are all 3 separate texts, as well as the Nag Hammadi Gospels, other than the Gospel of Thomas, that is, the Gospel of Philip, Gospel of Truth, Gospel of the Egyptians, the Coptic one, and the Gospel of Mary. We could also throw in the Greek Gospel of the Egyptians, the Gospel of Judas, the Fayum Gospel, and the Gospel of the Savior. So to state this information succinctly, between the 20s and 70s, we have 0 certain written narratives about Jesus. Between the 70s and 150, maybe at least as many as 8 or as many as 20. Further instances of written gospel-like literature, like the Diatessaron, the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, and the Protevangelium of James, followed soon thereafter in the late 2nd century. Again, the dating of all of these texts is debatable. And there were also others that we could add, and I'm sure that somewhere there's a PhD student right now discovering P-oxyskeet-Turner 3 that we know nothing about, and it'll change everything. But we may also observe with Tuckett the problematic issue that some texts having gospel titles in manuscripts carried little or no information about Jesus, and there were texts that represented themselves as teachings of Jesus that did not carry the gospel title. But in the very least, however, these numbers reveal that Mark's textualization of the Jesus tradition was a watershed act that was soon copied and to great effect. And we have to remember that in the years before the textualization of Mark or Q, it was not inevitable that oral tradition was going to be textualized. Early Jesus followers seemed to function just fine with oral tradition for decades before written tradition was originally written down. So this lecture shines a spotlight upon a serially underappreciated aspect of the development of the Jesus tradition among his followers, namely, that they explicitly draw attention to the fact that their presentation of the Jesus tradition is in manuscript form. Stated otherwise, they're not just copying Mark's innovation in terms of media, but they're purposefully doing so and pointing this fact out. More often than not, they do not make it out of the first words or sentences of their written Gospels before displaying this awareness. And it's a startling fact that the Gospels that can be dated to the 1st and 2nd century that immediately follow Mark, and for which good arguments can be made that they're dependent upon Mark, that is, Matthew, Luke, John, or Thomas, invariably display this textual self-awareness prominently at their opening or closing. Thus, although their moments of textual self-consciousness are entirely familiar and insignificant to modern scholars who encounter the Jesus tradition predominantly in written form, and who are typically more concerned with the author's Christologies or something like that, it seems to have been anything but insignificant to the ancient tradents who inherited Jesus tradition and redeployed it in written form. Let me start with Mark. Very briefly, Mark 13:14 clearly reveals the author's assumption that the tradition is written when it refers to the reader who must vocalize its script. Let the reader understand. Which, by the way, I don't know if any of you have ever talked to classicists about this verse. They cannot stand the translation of na eto as understand. They absolutely despise it. But I kept it because I'm not a classicist. Some interpreters have suggested otherwise, but the most obvious referent for the reader is the literate individual who would read the manuscript aloud to the gathered assembly, the majority of whom would not have been able to read it for themselves. Mark 13:14 is not a clear instance of competitive textualization, Furthermore, although Mark imbues his Jesus story with the Hebrew Scriptures, he does not do so in a way that can be construed clearly as a claim to a similar status or as a claim to liturgical status. Mark 13:14 is, however, an instance of textual self-consciousness. In other words, the tradition presents itself as manuscript. I suggest that this kind of textual self-consciousness gave birth to a more competitive textual process of textualization in subsequent Jesus tradition, beginning with the next oldest, the Gospel of Matthew. In borrowing from Mark's Gospel, Matthew 24:15 repeats the author's instructions to let the reader understand, and thus also self-consciously identifies as written tradition. Seemingly insignificant, this reflection of knowledge of Mark's Gospel is important, and I'll return to it shortly. Like Mark 13:14, Matthew 24:15 also is not itself an example of competitive textualization. Unlike Mark's Gospel, however, there are grounds for identifying a competitive strain of textual self-consciousness elsewhere in the Matthean narrative. Such grounds appear as early as the first sentence of Matthew's Gospel. And here I want to compare Mark 1:1 with Matthew 1:1. So Mark 1:1 is the beginning of the Gospel of Jesus Christ, Arche tu Euangeliou Jesu Christou. And Matthew 1:1 starts the book of the beginning of Jesus Christ, Biblos Geneseos Jesu Christou. Assuming with the majority of New Testament scholars the strong likelihood that Matthew has used Mark's Gospel as a source, Matthew makes two important alterations to Mark's incipit. First, he alters Mark's beginning of the Euangeliou of Jesus Christ to the Biblos of the beginning of Jesus Christ. Second, Matthew 1:1 uses Genesis for beginning instead of Mark 1:1's Arche, likely drawing upon Genesis 2:4 and Genesis 5:1 in Septuagint, where the phrase Biblos Geneseos also occurs. It may be possible that Matthew 1:1 has in its immediate purview the birth narrative of Matthew 1:1-2:23. Without denying this possibility, there are several reasons that scholars should not step farther and claim that the Biblos Geneseos of Matthew 1:1 cannot also have in its purview the rest of the gospel after Matthew 2. First, and perhaps to state the obvious, there's no known evidence of the incipit, genealogy, or the Matthean infancy narrative ever circulated without the rest of the gospel. Second, interpreting Biblos Geneseos as a record of the genealogy or an account of the origin misses a larger connection that Matthew is likely making with inherited Jewish tradition. As mentioned, the phrase Biblos Geneseos also occurs in Genesis 2:4 and 5:1 in the Septuagint. It's highly unlikely that Matthew is unaware of these texts, since he is one of three first-century authors of Jesus' books who begin their narratives with allusions to Genesis. The author of Mark's Gospel and the author of John's Gospel, if we put it in the first century, similarly opens their accounts of Jesus with arche and inarche, respectively, the latter of which is a verbatim citation of Genesis 1:1. Furthermore, as Davies and Allison observed, Genesis was a biblos, and its name was Genesis. They follow this observation to its logical conclusion. One is therefore led to ask, this quotation, one is therefore led to ask whether the introductory of Biblos Geneseos would not have caused Matthew's readers to think of the Torah's first book and to anticipate that some sort of new Genesis, a Genesis of Jesus Christ, would follow. It's difficult to think otherwise, end quote. I'm in agreement. And in the very least, it's clear that Matthew is following Mark's practice of opening his Jesus book with an allusion to Genesis. If Biblos Geneseos is therefore a purposeful allusion to the book of Genesis as the first book of Torah, the phrase's hermeneutical significance extends far beyond referring only to Jesus' genealogy. The author is claiming that with Jesus, a new creation or origin begins, but one that should be thought of in terms of the origin story in the book of Genesis. More important, this reference indicates another form of competitive textuality. Matthew's gospel is parasitically relying upon the authority of Genesis and Torah to undergird its presentation of a written narrative about Jesus. These observations gain even more force if the narrative structure of the five major discourses in Matthew's gospel is intended to mimic the five books of Torah. That's uncertain, it's not impossible, but it's heavily debated and there's no need to answer it here, but it suffices to observe that the likelihood of Matthew drawing upon the symbolic significance of Torah and Genesis and Matthew 1:1 stands regardless of whether you affirm that the rest of the narrative is a replication of the fivefold entity. Perhaps understandably, in light of the debates I mentioned, commentators have dedicated the bulk of their ink on Matthew 1:1 to Genesis. But the seemingly pedestrian occurrence of Biblos carries significance in its own right. As was already mentioned, the author of Matthew's Gospel repeats Mark 13:14's "let the reader understand" in Matthew 24:15 and does so verbatim. Scholars almost universally agree that by Matthew 24:15, Matthew has returned to following Mark's Gospel as a source and is directly dependent upon Mark 13:14. The author of Matthew's Gospel thus clearly knows Mark's Gospel as written tradition that requires a reader to actualize it, and Biblos is the term for such tradition. In this light, the nearly unquestioned familiarity of Matthew's Gospel with Mark's Gospel at both Mark 13:14 and Matthew 24:15, as well as Mark 1:1 and Matthew 1:1, becomes incredibly significant. Although serially overlooked in commentary discussions of Matthew 1:1, as well as in scholarly debates over the transition of euangelion as a term for oral proclamation to a term for written narrative, Matthew's adaptation of the Markan opening clearly attests the conviction that what Mark called the euangelion is a biblos. The combination of Mark 1:1, Matthew 1:1, and Mark 13:14 and Matthew 24:15 therefore complicates a long-standing debate over the earliest example of a Jesus follower using the term euangelion for written tradition. The generally agreed grounds for this debate are: 1. Paul in the gospel narratives use euangelion in reference to the oral proclamation of or about Jesus, likely a knowledge of the Greco-Roman usage of the term for a military or royal announcement, or the similar Asiatic or other Hebrew Bible usages of the term in reference to Yahweh, or both. 2. At some point in time, Jesus' followers began to use euangelion more specifically in reference to books, at least by the mid-2nd century with Justin Martyr, or some late 2nd century, early 3rd century usages of the term on manuscripts, P66, P75, and P4. 3. The usage of euangelion in Mark 1 most likely reflects the meaning of oral proclamation, not the Jesus book meaning. Beyond these general grounds, there's been great debate regarding when exactly the transition between the Pauline and the Jesus book meaning of euangelion occurred. Kester originally argued that Marcion was the first to use euangelion in reference to a written book. Stanton, on the basis of Matthew 26:13, and specifically on the basis of the demonstrative pronoun that Matthew often adds tuta to Mark's usages of euangelion, so it goes from being the gospel to this gospel, right? Stanton argues that Matthew is referring to his own text. I would love it if I could go with that, but I can't. While it's true that Mark's development of Paul's use, this is Stanton's words, while it's true that Mark's development of Paul's use of ta euangelion paves the way for later reference to the written story of the life of Jesus as ta euangelion, Mark did not take that step himself. Matthew, however, did. Similarly disagreeing with Kester, Kelhofer instead attributes the key step to the Didache. Picorni identifies Justin Martyr as the most ancient explicit evidence about the Gospels as books, though he nevertheless considers it likely that some references to the Gospel in 2nd Clement and the Didache are also references to Jesus books. As a side note, often overlooked in this debate is a reference to euangelia in the Epistle of Diognetus, where it's paired with the law and the prophets, so it's kind of quite clearly some type of book tradition. But as noted above, Mark 1:1 and Matthew 1:1, as well as Mark 13:14 and Matthew 24:15, contribute to this debate by providing substantial and explicit support to the idea that Matthew certainly conceptualized euangelion as a book, even if he did not clearly use the term as such. In other words, I agree with Stanton that actually Matthew did think of euangelion as book, but just not for the same reason that he does. These texts also complicate this debate, however, with respect to the scholarly conception of the decisive step in this development in the Jesus tradition. Stanton, though he's not alone in doing this, defines that key step in the quote that I just read to you as the linguistic usage of the term, rather than the media transition between orality and textuality. I'm inclined to give Mark slightly more credit than merely paving the way for a bookish understanding of Evangelion. Mark did not use Evangelion unambiguously as a reference to a book about Jesus, but he did textualize the Jesus tradition in the first place, and in this sense, he gave birth to the idea of good news about Jesus in written form. From this perspective, Mark, not Matthew, the Didacus, Justin Martyr, or Marcion, first presented the idea of the Evangelion in the written medium, and Matthew, very soon thereafter, affirmed this connection of ideas by referring to it as a biblos. How am I on time? I lost track. Couple minutes? All right. Okay, good. Important for present purposes, Matthew 1:1 and Matthew 24:15 display both textual self-consciousness and competitive textualization. Matthew's gospel presents itself as written tradition, but has in its peripheral vision other written tradition, especially Mark's gospel and Genesis and Torah, and positions itself with reference to those written traditions. In doing so, it implicitly and explicitly draws upon their authority in order to establish its own, which raises the question of its position toward the sources upon which it draws. I'm not presently concerned with whether the authors of Mark's or Matthew's Gospels considered their versions of the Jesus story authoritative on par with the holy texts of the Hebrew Scriptures, which is where this debate usually goes. It's enough for me to underscore that when the author of Matthew's Gospel asserts itself as a version of the Jesus story, it does so by not only presenting itself in precisely the same media format that Mark's Gospel and Torah did, but it also draws explicit attention to the fact by identifying it as a biblos that must be read aloud. The author of Matthew's Gospel thus attempts to occupy not only the same narrative space as Mark's Gospel, but also the same physical space in the hands of the reader. Matthew absorbs Mark's words at Matthew 24:15, but the implication is that the reader is now holding Matthew's Gospel instead of Mark's Gospel. On this basis, scholars, I think, are more correct in detecting a Matthean impulse to usurp Mark than they are in attempting to restrict Matthew's attitude to respectful. Of course, one does not have an outright rejection of Mark's Gospel in the Gospel of Matthew, and that's not my suggestion. My suggestion is that Matthew's Gospel is more nuanced than that. In its allusions to Moses and Torah, as well as its explicit citations and its verbatim and elusive reproduction of Mark's Gospel, the author of Matthew's Gospel uses a biblos, actually and narratively presented, to construct imaginatively a reading culture around itself, thereby also generating reading events of the written traditions upon which it draws. Matthew's Gospel cannibalizes Torah and Mark's Gospel, their contents, but also their media format as authoritative tradition. With reference to Johnson's theory of reading cultures, therefore, the narrative presentation of the Gospel of Matthew as a book roll serves every bit as much for the author of Matthew's Gospel as a boundary for identity as it does for those antiquarian elite readers that Johnson studies. Via competitive textualization, Matthew's Gospel makes a bid to stand in the stream of Jewish and Jesus tradition in written form. By all accounts, his replication of Mark's media format was overwhelmingly successful, if surviving manuscript and patristic citations are any indication of ancient reality. Matthew's Gospel would proceed to become substantially more popular than Mark's Gospel in the early church, but he did so by harnessing the technology and the Gospel format that Mark first introduced to the Jesus tradition. Thank you.
Okay, give us some questions.
Thanks, Chris. I liked the beginning of the citing from there. The fact that Matthew comes up with a textualized version of the Jesus tradition, and then it gets followed by so many other versions of this. Have you thought about the kind of social register that supports this?
Several of them, yeah. What direction?
It doesn't happen, say, with Mithraism. It doesn't happen with Jesus. In general, with Roman religion, there is a textualized version of Roman religion, but it's elites talking about Roman religion rather than the kind of primary purveyor. So,
yeah, I have given quite a bit of this, of what type of precedents or parallels there are to this, because I think that one of the main points of this chapter in this book is to say that this rapid proliferation of Gospels is is significant. That and in the larger version of this, I go on to deal with the Lucan prologue and in the end of John 20 and the end of John 21, and then the Gospel of Thomas kind of trumps them all by saying Jesus dictated this directly to me, and then it continues. The Apocryphon of James or John presents the apostles having these discussions, and the anti-Marcionite stuff starts getting in arguments over who wrote the Gospel, Peter or Jesus, and this type of rapid proliferation. I don't, because what I really would love to do is find a parallel in Jewish tradition that they seem to be back. And you do have this type of reproduction of the narrative when you get stuff like Jubilees representing the Sinai narratives and stuff like this. But you don't get them boom, 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 the way they happen here. So the short answer is yes, I've thought a lot about it, and I can't come up with an exact parallel. In talking with William Johnson about this, he mentioned we have a disagreement over whether they're actually trying to claim authority over each other. I view this very much as a competitive process. And he cited the Alexandrian Romance novels and all of the many different textual traditions there and how it doesn't seem to have that competitive impulse. So maybe just in terms of sheer quantity, there are some examples. But I see this as kind of a big game of ancient scribal leapfrog, each one trying to outdo the person that came before them.
You might look at the work of Kabbalah, this notion of free readers. So he talks about kind of sector of scribal culture. Giovanni Bazzana has worked on this too.
Okay.
These sort of documentary scribes that in their spare time are busy copying bits of Homer and Galen.
Yeah.
There's a kind of interlibrary loan system that's really in these Egyptian villages.
Yeah.
And if that's one of the locuses of cultural production from Christians, then that it's these guys. They make their living textualizing stuff.
Yeah.
And they make and then they naturally spend all their time textualizing the Jesus tradition. That can't be the only social location.
No, I've had this question for a long time, and I can't find anyone who's dealt with it in extended ways. Whether early Christians, Jesus followers, ever went to the public market to have text copied, or whether they were all done internally. Kim Heinz-Eitzen demonstrates that of the manuscripts that we have, they seem to have been produced by private networks.
Yeah,
I can't find a single example of a Christian going to say have a copy of the gospel reproduced in the Agora of the Forum.
I think that doesn't happen until Eusebius.
Eusebius, yeah. Well, even then it's internal, isn't it?
Yeah, but Vaticanus is produced in the scriptorium.
Yeah, but
pretty clearly. But the other ones aren't.
Yeah, but I'm talking about with outside the Christ group.
Yeah.
Whereas everyone else in antiquity, you needed a divorce certificate or a divorce contract or a deed registered. You just went to the local village scribe and they did it, regardless of what your affiliation was. But all the manuscripts that are produced within the Jesus movement seem to have stayed within there. So. Yeah.
Thanks, Chris. I wonder if I can ask you to say a little bit more why call this competitive, and why talk about it in terms of being parasitic, and why not call it collaborative and talk in terms of symbiotic? Why does it have to be leapfrog? Why can't it be a team game?
Because I don't think there was. More importantly, I don't think they're mutually exclusive options, and I don't think that it's really interesting. I've thought about doing this. There's a whole article to be written on people's hesitance to say that, for example, Luke thought that he was better than everybody that came before him. In commentaries, people inevitably, they'll say something like Loveday Alexander's monograph, classic monograph on the Lucan prologue. She will admit that Luke thinks he's better than everyone else, that this is a boast. And then 2 paragraphs later, she'll say, but there's no indication that he's trying to be better than his sources. It's like, well, which one is it? There's a real hesitance to do that. But I think that hesitance, I think that one of the reasons that I'm uncomfortable is that I think it's a byproduct of the canonization process, that we've just been geared to view these texts as somehow collaborative, somehow together because they were physically put together. But when you actually look at these, when you look at the Lucan prologue, many others had attempted to do this. I did it orderly. You know, I too decided to write. And thankfully, Theophilus, this is what's going to lead you to truth. Or in John 20, at the end of John 20 and John 21, Jesus did a lot of other things outside this book. You don't need all those. This is the one that will lead you to truth. This book. They know other versions of the Jesus story in written form, and they both assert that this is the one that contains truth. So I think my question is, why would you not?
You know, just on that point, if you read Quintilian on emulatio, emulation, which is the use of other people's sources, is inherently competitive.
Mm-hmm.
He says that you're vying with the original for beauty and the quality of expression.
You get the exact same thing with Josephus and Nicholas of Damascus. He states explicitly, it's very obvious that Nicholas of Damascus is a source for Josephus at several points in the narrative, and he states explicitly that his history wasn't very good and that Josephus can do it better.
Very, very, very quickly, to see you are desperate to answer this, I'm not being kind.
I don't know these sources that are cited, but I wonder if it's not imposition of a Western 21st century value on saying that this is a competitive undertaking.
You don't think people in the 1st or 2nd century were competitive?
No, that's not what I'm saying at all. As I said, I don't know all the sources, but couldn't it also be that the writers are trying to respond to different contexts? They've got different reasons for writing two different contexts. There's nothing explicit in the text to show that it isn't actually. The text.
Yes, there is. That's the point of my paper. But here's the other thing. These aren't mutually exclusive options. They may very well have their own community, however you define that. But when they invoke prior instances of Jesus tradition in reference to what they are doing now, they're making a bid to stand within that stream of tradition. This is where I think Johnson's work is very useful for thinking about reading events that are internal to the text. They are bringing into their narrative other texts, and they're asking the reader to think about what they're doing now in some type of reference to prior tradition. Sometimes, and I don't think that every attempt to replicate tradition is necessarily competitive in the ancient world, obviously. I just think in this particular stream, it is. In fact, you get Jesus going from the protagonist of the story in the Gospel of Mark, Luke, John, Matthew, to Jesus dictating the story in Thomas, to Jesus being the person who took stylus in hand and wrote the story by the 4th century. So they're pushing whatever version of the tradition they present, they're pushing it closer and closer and closer to Jesus, because they're claiming my source is closer to Jesus than this other source. So,
Fight. Thank you, Christopher. Wonderful.